And we are back. You are chatting with John P. Today, we are going to be comparing and contrasting a vintage, well, recently vintage, Rolex 16700 Pepsi GMT and the new Tudor Black Bay Pepsi GMT as well. We're going to compare and contrast them, get down and dirty, and talk about which one I think is a better watch and which one's a little bit under that. So we'll talk about that. But first, I'd like to thank you for tuning in. What we do is we talk about vintage watches and some other things thrown in between. Like and subscribe. I appreciate it. Leave in the comments things you want to see in the future. Also, check out delraywatch.com, actually, where both of these watches just sold yesterday, so they are not in stock, and they're both incredibly hot and in demand right now, but hopefully we get some sooner. But usually they blow out quickly before they hit the website, so stay tuned and always look at delraywatch.com to see the latest things that we get in stock. So let's talk about it, right? There's a lot of debate, there's a lot of buzz around this Tudor Black Bay GMT Pepsi. Pepsi is the thing that's going on right now in the industry. All the brands are making Pepsi, from the higher end brands, like Rolex, down to the more entry level brands. Pepsi is in, okay? And of course, it started with the granddaddy, the Rolex GMT Master. Pepsi, and sure, like Seiko made a Pepsi, and there's some other, models and brands that were there in the earlier days releasing Pepsi. And by Pepsi, for those of you that are not familiar, it's basically the bezel on these watches, the blue and the red, are the original Pepsi colors, Pepsi standard before they started releasing all the other versions and like the Pepsi Max and all that. But nonetheless, I digress. So let's jump right into the Rolex 16700, which is considered a transitional reference Rolex GMT Master. Now, this is before they transition it into the GMT Master 2. Now, this watch, this is... when you're into vintage and you hold one of these things, it's almost like the missing link between vintage and modern, and that's what I love. If you watched my video about the 16800 going into the 168,000, the Rolex Transitional Submariner, this is basically, and it's from the same era, but it's basically the equivalent, though, in the GMT Master variation, having the GMT hand. So let's talk about it. The dimensions of this. It's 40 millimeters by 12 millimeters thick. So by today's standard, it's a slimmer sports watch, especially considering Rolex's modern day maxi case. This specific example was released in 1990, and it features a sapphire crystal, the first in the GMT line for Rolex to have that. It has the Rolex 3175 hacking quickset 48-hour power reserve movement, so for its day and time, it was good. Today, a lot of brands in this segment, including their own, have a little bit better movements, but nonetheless, we're talking about a watch that's over 20 years old. So this one only features 100 meters water resistance. It does have a screw-down crown. You can jump in the pool with it, though it's vintage, so I don't recommend it, but it was originally intended to get a little bit wet, but it's not a Rolex Submariner. It's not a watch that should be dived with. It's a travel watch, a pilot's watch. Many pilots own these. This one features on the dial the white gold surrounds. They transitioned into the white gold surrounds surrounding the tritium on this dial, so it's obviously not the most modern lume that exists, though it still can function depending on the example you find. But what you find that the tritium lume markers actually aged, like on this one, and it's basically just the tritium, which is radioactive, burning out on the dial, creating kind of that custardy glow, patina to those markers for the hour indices that really make vintage something special. Now, the thing with this watch is the metal, right? The metal, I'll admit, the metal is not the latest variation of metal that's being produced in Rolex and Tudor watches, and you can certainly feel that in the bracelet. This bracelet does have a Jubilee on it. The GMT Master originally came on the Jubilee, and actually the modern one does as well now. But nonetheless, it did serve a place and purpose, and for the time it was top of the industry in the early 1990s and late 80s, which is what this reference comes from. Now, the rest of this case really quickly, it does feature a screw-down crown, which is nice to have considering the water resistance. The clasp does not have any type of locking mechanism. It's a simple fold-over, once again, to go over the bracelet. And overall, the wrist presence, it's very slim on the wrist. I have a 6.5-inch wrist, and it's almost the perfect size, and that is what sports watches were all about. The 40mm size during the late 80s and early 90s was really where these capped out before the big craze of the larger watch cases. Now, the price that we recently sold this for was $8,000 US, which was a steal of a price, pun intended. And so this was an $8,000 pre-owned watch. Usually these go for a little bit higher, but we took it in on trade and we wanted to pass along the value. So that covers that on its own. Now let's jump right into the Tudor Black Bay GMT Pepsi. Now this is the watch that was released in the last 2 years, and it is still a talk of the town. Now these things sell pre-owned for about the same price as retail because all of the Tudor collectors want them. Now, of course, there's going to be, some Tudor collectors that say it's not for me, I'm not into the Pepsi craze, but this is really the Tudor watch that everyone wants, aside from the Black Bay 58, and I can certainly see why. Now, let's go over the down and dirty specs on this. It's 41mm by 15mm thick. It's a heavier watch. It's maybe 20% heavier than the Rolex 16700. It's a thick watch. You put this on your wrist, and it has the heft, almost the heft and the presence of any of the modern day Rolex maxi cases, the Submariner, the GMT Master. It has the presence, the width, the thickness, and the overall weight of it is very maxi case. Now, the maxi cases, they come in at 40mm. This is 41, but the shape and size is a little bit different, so it wears pretty much the same, which is impressive considering coming from the Tudor, the more junior of the Rolex lineup. So it features that. Of course, it features a sapphire crystal. It's a modern watch. After all, latest 2 years, I think this example was from within the last year produced. It has a sapphire crystal, though it is domed, and it's made specifically for this watch to look like a early example GMT Master from the Rolex line to have an acrylic crystal. So it is domed, which is interesting because it's very different than the Rolex 16700, which we just talked about, that featured a flat sapphire crystal, which is a bit ironic because this is not vintage and that is. So it does show you something about kind of the chronological progression of watches and what they consider to be vintage and the features. So nonetheless, let's continue. This one features a metal bezel insert as well as the Pepsi from Rolex, which is interesting because in today's modern watch lineup, everyone's talking about ceramic, everyone's talking about these alternative materials, rubberized forms of bezels on some manufacturers, and Tudor wanted to take it OG, and they wanted it to be as vintagey as possible with the metal bezel, and I certainly can appreciate that, and it's constructed very well, and the lines are very crisp, and the numbers on the bezel are really reminiscent of something that would be in a vintage watch, even predating the Rolex that we just talked about. So let's continue on. This one has 200 meters water resistance, so it can take a bit more of a splash than the GMT Master. Though it's a modern watch, I don't recommend swimming with the vintage watch. Anyway, but this does feature a screw-down crown as well. You could probably get away with diving with this because, let's be real, who's diving to 300 feet? Very few people. I mean, most people that we come into contact with in the watch world, they have dive watches, but are they diving? And if they're diving, is it more than just the shallow end of the pool while they're taking care of their children on the weekend? I don't know. But for those of you that do get a little bit deeper, this can do it, and you can possibly swim between time zones. What else? The thing that I really need to drive home with this watch in comparison to the Rolex Pepsi, the 16700, is the movement. Now, this is the Tudor MT5652 in-house movement. Tudor developed this movement for this watch so that they can just, well, setting that aside, Tudor's developing their own movements for all of their watches, besides some of the Breitling movements that they're using in some of their watches. But they really needed to set themselves aside from the limitations of the ETA, which is, kind of your plug-and-play Swiss watch movements. There's limitations to that. You have to modify them, you have to put modules in, and sometimes that is just not the way that a brand like Tudor wants to go, because not only are they retrofitting parts, it just doesn't fit kind of the higher end mold that a brand like Tudor needs to fit in to command the price, which the price is about $4,000 retail. So this movement inside, which is the Tudor in-house, it does feature a 70-hour power reserve, which is maybe 35 to 40% higher than the Rolex, and certainly much higher considering the age of that Rolex compared with the age of all the components in this watch. So it does feature a much more technically sophisticated and advanced movement, but of course we're talking over 20 years difference in the two. You compare the other Rolex Pepsi to a modern day Rolex Pepsi, it's going to have the same differences, though. The other thing to keep in mind about this watch is the bracelet. Now with this Tudor Black Bay Pepsi, this bracelet, I'll admit, it looks beautiful. The heft, it's got a lot of heft to it, it's got a lot of weight, and it does feel great on the wrist, especially if you like a heavier bracelet. Here's kind of the controversial thing about this bracelet. It features a replica rivet. Now, replica is a word that we don't really like to talk about in watches because it means something very negative, but it's the bracelet on this is made to look like the riveted vintage Rolex bracelets, which go for thousands on their own sometimes, US dollars resale price. And what I don't like about this specifically, just putting my interjection of personal opinion in this, is that they're not actually rivets. They put these end caps on the bracelet to make the bracelet look like it's pounded metal together, and it's just not. They also mixed kind of these rivets with screws, and it looks nice, but you can tell that it's really just an aesthetic thing, and that's something for a vintage guy I can't really come to terms with, and I think other vintage guys that you read about on the forums or in person and you talk with them, they have a lot of the same gripes with that. But other than that, the bracelet does feature the fold over clasp that Tudor has on their models. It's very smooth, the action is great, it locks in place, it has the little lip there, so it's very easy, and that's something the Rolex does not feature. You have the Jubilee bracelet, okay, I'm not comparing apples to apples here, but to give you perspective of a true vintage watch, it has this clasp that will loosen up, it will come loose, it's difficult to tighten, you have to bend the metal, and of course it will suffer from the bracelet sag, which, one thing I'd like to mention, Tudor has the one redeeming quality about the rivet bracelet, besides the other things that I mentioned, is that you can tell that the way that it's constructed and tightened, it probably will stand the test of time much better than the vintage Rolexes, considering in the way that it's built, in the sagginess, you can tell that it will compensate itself for sagginess in the future based on the way that it's constructed, and the metal is so precise and tight. I just can't see the bracelets on this suffering from the same kind of sag as the Rolex. Now, let's just set these two side by side and talk about just the way that they look. I think that for some people that can be very important, considering you may want a vintage look, but you may not want all the things that come with vintage. And this is something I've talked about in my previous videos. The kind of the nuances with vintage, I don't mind them, but if you're a very active guy, you go swimming, water, running, jogging, all that stuff, and you just don't have room for tolerance, you need to go modern. And so when you look at them, I would say to the untrained eye, someone that's completely out of the watch space, someone that, maybe your girlfriend, your wife, I don't know, your fiance, anybody that doesn't really know watches, they would probably say that there's not a lot difference. They're going to say this one's bigger than this one, the Rolex looks a little bit older than the Tudor, the Tudor might even be a little more attractive to a female, because if you look on the Tudor website, they have all of their watches, including this watch, being put on females' wrists, but certainly you don't see that from the Rolex brand. Rolex has really not jumped into that kind of territory yet. So based on the things that we talked about here, I think it's very fair to say the verdict is in, and overall, spec by spec, the Tudor is a better watch. It's got a longer power reserve, it can go deeper in the water, it's a sports watch that doesn't suffer from the same kind of bracelet sag that the vintage Rolex is going to have, and it just will stand the test of time better considering the higher level of fit, finish, components, and functions of the watch. It's just overall designed to be a better, longer lasting watch, and it's also half the price. Now, that doesn't mean that because it's, objectively a better or higher scoring watch that you don't like the vintage Rolex a lot better. I personally love the vintage Rolex GMT Master a lot better. The lume is perfectly aged. The cream indices here, it's just absolutely gorgeous. The way that the metal bezel has aged, you can see that they tried to replicate that in the Tudor, but they tried to replicate a piece of art. It's almost like when an artist makes a painting, like this Rolex, for example. An artist makes a painting which is this GMT Master, and then eventually you have these print houses that come out with these prints, and it looks the same, and you can put it on your wall, and it serves the same kind of purpose and function, but it's just not the same. And that's what we get with the Tudor. A piece of paper that comes out of a printing machine is going to be able to stand the test of time a little bit better than oil on canvas, but all in all, it's just not the original, and that's kind of what I get from the two. So you really need to decide, if you're trying to choose between these two watches, do you want to have the watch that's half price, that you can bang up, that's going to last longer power reserve, that you can certainly do whatever you want with, jump in the water, take a shower, anything you want to do with this watch, this Tudor is made to do it? Or do you want the original, something that you should be a little more cautious about, something that is a little more of a statement, but you have to pay twice as much? Now, that's a choice that you have to make, and I can't tell you which way to go, but if you're a vintage guy, I think it's very clear that you're a vintage guy for a reason. You should get the vintage if you can swing it, and if you're a modern guy and you like all those things, you jump in the pool, all that stuff, you have to go with the Tudor. And yeah, I'm not wearing a watch because I was just wearing these for a little bit, trying to get a feel for them, and I am decided. I would choose the GMT Master. What would you guys choose? Leave in the comments below. Would you choose are you more a modern guy? Would you choose the Tudor, or do you want the original OG, the vintage classic GMT Master 16700 Pepsi comparison? Here we have it. Leave in the comments below. I want to hear your opinion, or maybe you want to buy both of them, but we're sold out. So if you are interested, we can probably find them. Reach out and I'll see how we can help you. Thanks for watching, guys. You have been chatting with John P. Ciao.